What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, we got a good one for you guys. This is going to be part 2 in our top 10 players for 2021. This is going to be going through the top 20 players 11 through 20, players that are slated to make major impacts for our teams come fantasy draft time. Before we do get into the video though, just a quick shout out that our draft package is currently available for purchase. We've added more information while also simplifying things, so it's safe to say that this draft package is as easy to digest as any other draft package we've ever produced. So if you're interested in locking in your draft package today, you can do that at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. The link for that, as always, is in the description box below. With that being said, let's hop over to our stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was how many quarterbacks scored over 20 fantasy points per game last season. The correct answer was actually 12. Congratulations to Jacob, who got this right on Twitter. And as for YouTube, Royal Awesome NE519 was the first to get that right, so congratulations to both of you. But as for today's stat of the day, Alvin Kamara and one other running back led the league last season with 5 receiving touchdowns. Which other running back outside of Alvin Kamara was that? Once again, that's which other running back outside of Alvin Kamara led the league last season in receiving touchdowns with 5. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Alright guys, without further ado, let's hop right into the video, and what better place to start than with the 11th ranked player based upon current ADP. And believe it or not, 11 picks in, this is where we get just our second wide receiver coming off the board. This player is none other than Tyreek Hill, and if I were to sit here and potentially make a case for him to be drafted higher, I don't think it would be very difficult to get many people to agree with me. For starters, whenever we're looking for wide receivers to be targeting, you always want to couple them with a very strong quarterback. And when looking for sheer arm talent alone, it's hard to find a better quarterback than that of Patrick Mahomes. This is the same quarterback who we'd seen back in 2018 throw for over 5,000 yards and even throw for 50 touchdowns. And although this Kansas City Chiefs offense is filled with weapons like Travis Kelce at the tight end position, you do know that when it comes to the wide receiver position, there won't be a wideout in this offense targeted at a higher rate than that of Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill, over his past 2 full healthy seasons, has played very consistently. In both 2018 and 2020, a mere 2 targets separated the 2 seasons, with 137 targets in 2018, 135 in 2020. In both of those seasons, he was able to convert those targets into 87 receptions. 2018, he nearly eclipsed 1,500 receiving yards to go along with 12 receiving touchdowns. And this past season, on the back of another 87 receptions, he posted nearly 1,300 receiving yards to go along with a whopping 15 receiving touchdowns. It shouldn't be too much of a surprise that he finished as the number 1 and number 2 fantasy wide receiver in each of those seasons. And heading into the 2021 season, we should expect much of the same. Not much is actually changing from this team offensively. In fact, the biggest change from one season to another is actually going to be the loss of Sammy Watkins. With Sammy Watkins no longer a Kansas City Chief, this could open up even more opportunities and a higher target market share for Tyreek Hill at the wide receiver position. And even if ultimately the loss of Sammy Watkins in this offense only adds up to an extra 5 to 10 targets for Tyreek Hill across the entire season, one of the things that makes Tyreek Hill such a unique and dynamic playmaker is his ability to do a lot on a small target market share. Few wide receivers in the entire NFL have the ability to take a slant to the house from 80 yards out, and with Tyreek Hill having that unique skill set and Patrick Mahomes always able to put his playmakers in the best position possible, an extra 5 to 10 targets spread across the entire season, while that would be very negligible fantasy production for some players, when it comes to Tyreek Hill, this is something that could make an actual sizable impact. Now, Tyreek Hill is going in a stage of the draft where most of the top running backs are no longer on the board. Tyreek Hill is going to be one of the top receivers that are going to be drafted, either the first wide receiver off the board or the second wide receiver off the board. And with a lot of the circumstances for the Green Bay Packers being largely unknown, whether Aaron Rodgers is going to be the starter for the 2021 season, I could see a case to be made for taking Tyreek Hill as the first wide receiver off the board for the 2021 season. Alright guys, guys, we're moving into the next player off the board. This is going to come in at an ADP of 12th overall. We're bouncing back to the running back position, and we're starting with none other than Cam Akers of the LA Rams. Now, when it comes to Cam Akers, this is a player that I believe a lot of people are going to be a bit hesitant to pull the trigger in the early stages of the draft. Reason being is that Cam Akers is not really a household name. When you're buying into Cam Akers, you're buying into the offense to potentially nab what could be a 3-down workhorse in one of the league's most potent offenses. Now, why I say some people might be a bit hesitant to pull the trigger on him is because he hasn't really been there before. Cam Akers, being drafted just last season, was competing for touches with a handful of other running backs, including Darrell Henderson. A common theme that we've seen from the LA Rams since Sean McVay has been the head coach has been any rookie running backs newly coming into the offense, they don't quite get the opportunity out of the gate. We saw the same thing with Darrell Henderson in his rookie season, not really getting the touches until about the midway point of the season and on. So when looking back at the 2020 season, we shouldn't penalize Cam Akers for not having a sizable workload coming right out of the gate. The main workload initially to start the season was actually mostly given to Darrell Henderson, who received double-digit touches on the ground in 5 of his first 7 games, including work in the receiving game, where in 3 of his first 5 games, he received a minimum of at least 3 targets. All in all, it was looking like Darrell Henderson could potentially take lead back duties for this offense, not only to just start the season, but from that point forward. And while that would be a little bit odd for Darrell Henderson just due to his body type and skill set, whenever a player in any offense is receiving that type of a workload, you definitely have to take notice. When it comes to Cam Akers though, this is definitely a running back better suited to take a 3-down workhorse type of role. When comparing the size of both running backs, you have Darrell Henderson coming in at 5'8", 200 flat. Compare that to Cam Akers, who's 5'11", 212 pounds, definitely has that build for 3-down back duties. Size isn't the only thing he has. He also has athleticism and speed. In fact, he runs a 4.47 40, which is in the 87th percentile. His height adjusted speed score is in the 89th percentile. So at any point where Cam Akers is getting the lion's share of the touches in this offense, from a size standpoint, from an athleticism standpoint, you know Cam Akers is coming in with the entire package. Now, like clockwork, similarly to what we had been seeing the previous 2 seasons with the LA Rams in the way that they like to give touches to their young and inexperienced running backs, we saw with Cam Akers that from the halfway point and on, he was really getting the lion's share of the touches in this offense. Even going back and looking at some of the touch totals that Cam Akers was able to compile down the stretch, it's quite remarkable. We're talking week 13, 22 touches, week 14, 32 touches, week 15, 18 touches. He didn't play in week 16, but to round out the season, week 17, another 25 touches. These are touch totals that we've yet to see any running back be given under Sean McVay, excluding Todd Gurley. So many people, us included, are extremely excited to see what Cam Akers can bring to the table with those types of touch totals for the 2021 season. Sean McVay has already came out on multiple occasions and said that he sees and envisions Cam Akers as a 3-down workhorse. So anybody really concerned that these types of touches were only due to running backs being injured or potentially these touch totals could be fluky, all the information that we have does point to the contrary. And when looking at the types of running backs that are in the offense to potentially take away touches like a Darrell Henderson, we already know Darrell Henderson and his skill set is better suited to play that of a change of pace role. Alright guys, we're on to the next player and we're bouncing back to the wide receiver position. The next player we're talking about is none other than A.J. Brown of the Tennessee Titans. Now, making a case for A.J. Brown to have success for 2021 is relatively easy. We already know to begin with that he's a complete stud. He's one of the few players that doesn't require a high amount of targets in order to get it done for fantasy. In fact, in his rookie season, he was able to put in a top 10 finish in standard scoring leagues on the back of a mere 84 targets. Then for 2020, despite only appearing in 14 games and being pretty banged up in some of the other ones, he only did receive 106 targets this past season, but was able to turn those mere 106 targets into yet another top 10 finish in standard scoring leagues and even a top 12 finish in PPR leagues. He is now coming off of back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons, and with the Tennessee Tennessee Titans moving away from playmakers like Corey Davis, as well as Jonnu Smith at the tight end position, this Tennessee Titans team is going to be lacking playmakers, meaning A.J. Brown is going to be relied upon this season now more than ever. I don't think there is an analyst or person out there that isn't expecting A.J. Brown to see the most amount of targets he's seen in his entire career, or at least compete for that number. And if we ever give A.J. Brown an opportunity share, like some of the other top wide receivers in the league where they're getting 130 plus targets, A.J. Brown could legitimately put up 1,800 plus yards. Now, my only concern with this Tennessee Titans offense as a whole comes down to how thin they are when it comes to depth. If there's an injury to the running back position, Derrick Henry misses time, that's going to extremely hurt this offense. And with A.J. Brown being the only real competent wide receiver that we can really count on right out of the gate, while he is too talented of a wide receiver to really struggle if defenses do try to put extra attention to him, I don't think he's going to be able to be stopped just by putting extra emphasis to stop him defensively. But I do think the extra plays, extra usage for a player that is already proven to be banged up in his first 2 seasons in the NFL could end up translating to some injuries down the stretch. Now, if A.J. Brown does struggle with some injuries, I do believe this Tennessee Titans offense could struggle mightily. And for that, I do think that does increase the overall risk that you're going to take on when drafting A.J. Brown, but the upside more than makes up for it. The next player we don't really need to spend too much time on because I think we all can agree at exactly how much of a stud he is. And the next player we're talking about is, of course, Travis Kelce of the Kansas City Chiefs. Like I had mentioned, though, a strong case doesn't really need to be made for him. His production over the past several seasons more than makes a case for him to be drafted at this point or potentially higher. I do believe that Travis Kelce, just due to being such a difference maker at his position, means he's exactly the type of player I could see creeping up into that first round. Looking back at the production he's posted over the last consecutive 5 seasons, he has been the tight end one for all of fantasy football in every season since 2016. That's right, 2016 ranked first, 2017 first, 18, 19, and this past season, all of which he finished as the top tight end in all of fantasy football. Even looking back at the sheer fantasy points he was able to put up this past season in a PPR league was 312 points. When we compare that to other positions like wide receivers and running backs, he's posting more fantasy points than players like Calvin Ridley, a mere 15 fantasy points away from players like Stefon Diggs and Derrick Henry. So this is a player that at the tight end position, a position that historically just doesn't score as many points as nearly any of these other top skill positions, Travis Kelce is breaking that mold completely. Now, one other thing that is worth mentioning is that there are other tight ends in this day and age that are putting up similar points to that of Travis Kelce, but none of them have the safety that comes along with the pick of Travis Kelce, who, like I had mentioned, has finished as the #1 overall tight end in every season since 2016. One thing I had also mentioned is that Sammy Watkins is no longer on the team. Sammy Watkins did serve as the 3rd highest targeted receiver in this offense while healthy, and with the 3rd highest targeted receiver in this offense now off the team, that does potentially bring in the possibility for more targets to go the way of Travis Kelce. While I don't believe that should be a major difference maker or deciding factor on if you're going to draft Travis Kelce or not, if you're looking for just reasons to add on to the potential upside he could bring for the 2021 season, that is definitely a factor contributing to that. Alright guys, we'd mentioned this player already a couple times in this video, so you had to know he was coming eventually, but the next player we have up is Stefon Diggs of the Buffalo Bills. Stefon Diggs is just an elite playmaker, to put it simply. One thing we always try to avoid on draft day is targeting receivers that have recently changed teams. Whenever a free agent receiver does change teams, we always have a bit of a learning curve when it comes to establishing a connection with the new quarterback. There are some growing pains and some bumps in the road, typically at the earlier portions of the seasons, and for that, free agent wide receivers are typically players that we either have to drop a little bit down in the rankings than where they normally should be. They bring in additional risk that other receivers don't bring to the table that have already established connections and chemistry with their starting quarterback for several years. And with Stefon Diggs previously being reported as a disgruntled player with the Minnesota Vikings, there were many risk factors associated with the draft pick of Stefon Diggs, making the value he returned for you on draft day by taking him at his draft day price tag all but a guarantee. Now fast forward to the 2021 offseason, we know Stefon Diggs proved all the haters wrong, finishing third overall out of all wide receivers with 328 PPR fantasy points. That's on the back of a massive 166 targets, converting that into 127 receptions for 1,535 receiving yards to go along with 8 touchdowns. Clearly, this was a player that produced on the back of a lot of volume. 166 targets is just something we don't typically see for any wide receiver in the league, let alone a wide receiver on a new and changing team. So for anyone to have any concerns heading into the 2021 season, they really aren't warranted. One thing we also know is that the Buffalo Bills are coming into this season with less receiving weapons. That's right, they did get rid of receiver John Brown. Is that ultimately going to have a major impact on the workload and volume load for a player like Stefon Diggs? No, most likely not, but it is a factor contributing as to why we should continue to expect Stefon Diggs to continue to be heavily involved in this passing offense. Moving into the next player we have on our top 20 list is none other than DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. After seeing what he was able to do in his rookie season on film as well as statistically, many people were on board with a potential DK Metcalf breakout year this season. So for us to sit back and say that a DK Metcalf breakout was just something not many people could expect would just be a false statement. This is of course a wide receiver who's been posting some of the most unbelievable measurables from an athletic standpoint. We're talking a wide receiver who's 6'3", 228 pounds, a player who looks like he doesn't have an ounce of body fat on him, who runs a 4.33 40-yard dash time. You don't need me to tell you, but that's in the 99th percentile. Looking at his height adjusted speed score, it doesn't get any worse. We're talking 99th percentile there, 97th percentile burst score, and even a 91st percentile catch radius. We all knew that the physical tools that were given to DK Metcalf allowed him to potentially be one of the league's top receiving talents, but we've seen historically time and time again some of these athletes that just have these insane measurables and they can't quite make the adjustments. A lot of players that could get by on their sheer athleticism alone at a college level, when transitioning to the NFL, sometimes they struggle and don't necessarily make it. What we saw from DK Metcalf in his rookie season, though, did prove enough to many of us out there to know that DK Metcalf is going to be a stud on the NFL level. It was only going to be time that would tell. In his sophomore season, DK Metcalf really put on a show, receiving 129 targets, converting that into 83 receptions for over 1,300 receiving yards to even go along with 10 touchdowns. One thing we have to keep in mind is that this was on the Seattle Seahawks offense, which is never going to be near the top of the league when it comes to overall volume from a receiving and passing standpoint. So ultimately, when we have players like Stefon Diggs, who's finishing the year with 166 targets, expecting that type of workload to go over to a player like DK Metcalf is just an unreasonable expectation. Regardless though, DK Metcalf has now cemented himself as one of the most talented playmakers in the entire NFL at the wide receiver position, and heading into this next season, what's typically the breakout season, which is the third year by any NFL wide receiver, there is a lot to love about DK Metcalf and the potential upside he brings to the table. Russell Wilson throughout this offseason has been very vocal about wanting to have more passing volume for the team, and while they haven't been necessarily the most receptive to the wants of Russell Wilson, at least not recently, anybody who's drafting DK Metcalf can rest assured knowing that there should be some natural progression from any young receiver in their first few seasons in the NFL. Alright guys, we're moving on to the next player, and it shouldn't come as too much of a surprise that we're continuing the run at the wide receiver position to another player who's a complete stud, and that's DeAndre Hopkins of the Arizona Cardinals. My main concern with potentially drafting DeAndre Hopkins last season was overall going to come down to the potential volume and workload that we could expect with him in this new offense, and similarly to what we saw with Stefon Diggs, DeAndre Hopkins knocked that ball right out of the park. In his first season as an Arizona Cardinal, he received a whopping 160 targets, converting that into 115 receptions to go along with 1,400 receiving yards, and even caught 6 touchdowns. What I will say is that the receiving touchdowns is on the low end for that high amount of targets. We're talking 160 targets to only convert into 6 receiving touchdowns. If this was on an offense offense that was on the lower end of the spectrum, somebody that we don't expect to put up much over 20 points, then I definitely would suspect that 160 targets may not translate to much more than 6 receiving touchdowns. But when you're on an offense led by Kyler Murray that has plenty of scoring opportunities, also an offense that's a bit starved for high-end talent, that's where DeAndre Hopkins definitely fits the bill for this team. So I would suspect that if DeAndre Hopkins were to receive a similar type of target market share in this offense, the receiving touchdowns would definitely be a bit higher in his second year on this roster. So if I'm expecting DeAndre Hopkins to be more productive on a per target basis based off that previous statement, then the main question for DeAndre Hopkins, whether if he's a value in this range of the draft or not, has to come down to whether I believe he's going to receive a similar target market share or not. When it comes to DeAndre Hopkins, I 100% believe he is going to receive a high amount of targets similar to what he saw last season. Reason being is that this team didn't bring in any weapons to really compete with him from a depth chart perspective. They also did feel comfortable enough with letting go of Kenyon Drake, leaving Chase Edmonds to be the lead back in this backfield, meaning the strength of the running backs, or at least the depth at the running back position, is going to be coming in a bit weaker than what we saw a season ago. If the running back position for the Cardinals is coming in a bit weaker, then you are going to have to expect that the production from the quarterback and the wide receivers is going to have to make up for some of that, meaning overall, yes, I do believe that the volume for a player like DeAndre Hopkins should remain similar or possibly even see an uptick. Alright guys, we're moving on to the next player. It's the final wide receiver on this list, and it's none other than Calvin Ridley of the Atlanta Falcons. Now when it comes to Calvin Ridley, I believe this ADP is going to stem from being on the back of Julio Jones possibly returning. If we had news that Julio Jones and the Atlanta Falcons were going to part ways, then I definitely suspect that the ADP for a player like Calvin Ridley would be much higher. Looking back at what Calvin Ridley was able to do just last season, in 2020, he did finish as a top 5 wide receiver in PPR, top 4 in standard scoring. That was on the back of 143 targets, converting that into 90 receptions for 1,374 receiving yards to even go along with 9 receiving touchdowns. Now, when it comes to the Atlanta Falcons, this is a team that we can definitely expect for a lot of production from the passing game. Matt Ryan inherently is a pure pocket passer. This isn't a player who's going to be getting a lot of yardage on the ground. He's not going to rush in a lot of touchdowns. So whenever they're in the red zone or between the 20s, you know Matt Ryan is going to be getting it done with his arm. This does mean that the level of production that we were seeing from Calvin Ridley last season is going to be close to what we can expect to see once again for the 2021 season, as long as Julio Jones is on the roster. While I did indicate that the ADP for Calvin Ridley is likely going to skyrocket if Julio Jones is distributed to a different team, whether that be through trade or if he's released, I do strongly believe that people are going to see Julio Jones exiting as a positive thing for Calvin Ridley. And while yes, that is going to increase his overall ceiling, I personally would be a bit concerned with how many more scoring opportunities this team will have without Julio Jones on the field. Julio Jones, as we know, is a player who does most of his damage between the 20s, not really a big threat in the red zone, which is exactly a factor that can help a receiver in fantasy football like Calvin Ridley. Julio Jones consistently helping getting this team into scoring position while not always being the person to score the touchdown is ultimately going to help a player like Calvin Ridley put up more fantasy points on the field. And with this team making a major statement in the draft by taking Kyle Pitts 4th overall, an offensive player, to a team that we would have thought would have targeted more defensive players, the Atlanta Falcons are undoubtedly trying to make a statement that they don't want to be beaten by anyone offensively. Alright guys, we're moving on to our final 2 players, and we don't have any more skill position players. We now have 1 quarterback and 1 tight end left, and you know which player's coming next. It's the quarterback, and it's Patrick Mahomes of the Kansas City Chiefs. Right off the bat, I'll be one of the first people to say that I haven't really been a fan of targeting quarterbacks early throughout my time playing fantasy football, but in this season, now more than ever, I'm starting to change the way I'm thinking about it. Patrick Mahomes, similarly to Travis Kelce, does give you a positional advantage, allowing you to be a bit weaker in other areas like running back, wide receiver, or flex, which can definitely lighten the workload if ultimately any of your players bust throughout the week. One thing I will say though is that when looking at players to have performances like Travis Kelce at the tight end position, finding those types of tight ends is a bit more few and far between, whereas finding a quarterback to produce at a similar level to Patrick Mahomes, you have a much easier task on your hand finding a player to produce players like him at the quarterback position, whereas the tight end position, there really is just a few guys and nobody else, and the quarterback position is one that's much easier to play the matchups with. Regardless though, Patrick Mahomes is hands down the best quarterback and the one that, if you're making a bet, is the most likely to finish as the number one in all of fantasy at the quarterback position. Your money should really be on Patrick Mahomes, which is why I really can't hate as much as I would like to Patrick Mahomes having an ADP in the back of the second round. Usually I like to target quarterbacks that have more rushing upside, and while Patrick Mahomes, he is more mobile than most of the quarterbacks in the league, he's not going to be one to be posting 600, 800, 1,000 rushing yards, which while it does hurt him from a floor standpoint week over week, it is going to help his ability to remain healthy and stay on the field. Alright guys, we're moving into the final player on our top 20 list. It shouldn't be too much of a surprise to see a second tight end actually creep into the top 20. That player, George Kittle of the San Francisco 49ers. You've already heard me mention multiple times throughout this video about how much of a positional advantage getting Travis Kelce on your roster brings to your team. And the reason for that is because very few tight ends have the ability to put up the types of points that Travis Kelce brings to the table each and every week. One of the few tight ends that actually can compete with Travis Kelce tit for tat is George Kittle of the 49ers. And had George Kittle not been dealing with injuries throughout the 2020 season, I believe personally his ADP would even be that much higher. Looking back at what he'd been able to do in the two prior seasons before this past season, in 2019 with the 49ers, he only appeared in 14 games, yet still was able to finish as the second best tight end for all of fantasy on the back of only 107 targets, converting that into 85 receptions for over 1,000 receiving yards to go along with 5 touchdowns. Then looking back at the 2018 season, the last full healthy season we'd seen of George Kittle, this is more likely to what we should expect to see for the 2021 season. 136 targets, converting that into 88 receptions for 1,377 receiving yards and yet another 5 touchdowns. Like I had mentioned, just few tight ends in the entire league are able to put up that type of production, and had George Kittle not been injured over the past 2 seasons, we definitely wouldn't even see his ADP fall as low as it is today, so we should be taking advantage of it. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hope you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.